Joining us now for World Brief and the review of some of the headlines of today's newspapers from around the world is Adefemi Akinsanya. Good morning, Adefemi.
Good morning, Dr. Women. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm fine.
Good morning, Mumbai. Good morning, Mumbai.
Rainy morning.
A rainy morning, is it not?
Yeah.
I was just saying that it just feels sometimes like coming into the office in the early morning with all of this. Sometimes it feels like you're coming to war because everyone's trying to get to their destination very, very quickly. But good morning to you, viewers. Moving on to news headlines from across the globe, we'll begin here in Nigeria with This Day newspaper. We will first actually discuss our global headline stories before moving on to the newspapers. Sorry, I was just a bit misled by the prompter there. If we firstly take a look at US politics, we all know that President Biden has been hosting leaders in Washington, D.C. as part of this NATO alliance meeting. And in addition to discussing the need to increase spending for NATO itself, they're also discussing the impacts of spending on warfare across the country, across the world rather. So they're looking at increasing spending and military aid towards Ukraine. There's been a resolution of some NATO countries to send weapons over to Ukraine in order to help it in its fight against Russia and their invasion within the confines of the country. What we're seeing there is the arrival of Turkish President Erdogan and his wife Emine. And also, you've got representatives of Romania and Spain. Romania and Turkey are two countries that also have made it clear that they will also be donating weaponry and weapons to Ukraine in its fight against Russia's invasion. In addition to that, just looking at Biden specifically, he spoke at length. He spoke for 13 minutes. If you listen to the speech, you'll know that he did sound very, very confident. There weren't any large gaps in between his speech. There wasn't stumblings. He did sound to be in control of this speech. Rufai, I beg, let him have this one. Take your foot off his neck this one time. So he did, I think for these 13 minutes, he did present himself well, speak authoritatively, and I do think that it will go some way to calming some of the noise coming from Democrats. That being said, more and more Democrats are coming out. The numbers reached more than 7 now of House Democrats saying that they think that it's time for Joe Biden to gracefully bow out of this campaign to be re-elected. It doesn't seem that that's something that Biden wants to do, but that is the lion's share of what's been happening in Washington and with this NATO summit. Let's not forget that former President Donald Trump has challenged Biden to another debate, so it will be interesting to see when the next time these two people will go head-to-head. I can't imagine that the Biden camp would be rushing for another televised debate, but we'll keep our eyes on that. Moving on to another story now. Campaigns in France. Okay, let's take a look at these pictures. Pictures are showing UK Parliament sitting for the first time since Starmer was elected. Today is Wednesday, so it will be his first PMQs, Prime Ministerial Questions. So he will be, this is the first time you'll see him sitting across from his peers and debating. Usually, PMQs they can actually be quite fiery, quite animated. It's usually where people like to drag each other's singlets. So it will be interesting to see whether or not. No, honestly, it does get very spicy at PMQ questions. It's essentially people in dresses and suits tearing each other's singlet. So we'll see what happens for Starmer's first PMQs. But again, there's been lots of criticism of him in just as expected, but also in lines with defense spending, more papers are calling on him to speak openly about how much he wants to spend on defense. So you know that this is a government that is definitely going to increase taxes here and there, believes in more people spending for the betterment of the country, but it will be interesting to see what defense looks like in that arena. Moving on to France. France's election woes will continue, but one thing that's really interesting coming out is that Carla Bruni, who is the wife of former French President Nicolas Sarkozy, has just been charged in witness tampering. You'll be aware that Nicolas Sarkozy has been accused of receiving illicit funds from Muammar Gaddafi and Libya for his own campaign, and it's believed that his wife Carla has been involved in some form of intimidation and tampering of a witness. So she's been charged. She's also been bailed. So it's not as if she's behind bars now, but it just shows the severity of this issue. And for this example, people are not above the law, whether or not you're a former president or not. So it is going to be something that many people are keeping their eyes on.
I mean, that story, I remember when that story broke. That's the great work of good investigative journalism. I think Media Power, independent investigative journalism, so I did a lot of work on that Gaddafi scandal when it broke. Although Sarkozy could rummage his way through it, but Carla Bruni, his very popular celebrity wife, was formerly married to Eric Clapton, if my memory serves me right, and a couple of other, I think with Gaga to a couple of other men, has been tampered now for witness tampering. Let's see how this case pans out. As regards Joe Biden, Femi, what they're trying to sell is a malarkey to me. I think Joe Biden has deteriorated, and I keep insisting on that fact. And the truth has to be said. And please, if he really wants to dare, he should go for another debate with Trump. Femi, since all of this has happened, he's had an interview on Morning Joe, which is like friendly territory.
Right.
I dare Joe Biden to go and interview on Sean Hannity's show on Fox if he really says that he's now better. Then he's had 2 interviews on radio stations where they wrote the questions in advance. Is that media exposure? It's just a lot of malarkey. He should go for another debate with Trump, let's say it. The Democrats will be whipped.
Very quickly, on the NATO summit, what caught my attention, besides the Biden speech, was the body language from those countries, the other countries, especially the European countries, your Lithuania and so forth, who've attended. Because there's a report I read that said that there was a lot of Gulf language that was used within the meetings. Now, we know that one of the biggest talking points at this particular summit is budgets and defense spending, because we know that NATO calls for 2% defense budgets for each of their member states, and most of them have not been meeting up with that, which is one of Trump's biggest cards. Trump feels that America is tired of carrying all these countries on their back. And now it was interesting to see that these European countries have come with Gulf language, which we all know Trump is a massive golf lover, and they're saying NATO is like a golf club. We should all pay our dues so we can enjoy fair play and we can enjoy unlimited play on the golf course. So for me, that body language says to me that NATO and member states who have come to this summit are already planning for a Trump presidency. A lot of the smaller European countries are already making provision to make sure that they can meet with that 2% defense threshold required by NATO, because they know that should President Trump come in, former President Trump come in, it's going to be a massive contentious issue. So apart from the European countries, we also have Canada and Prime Minister Trudeau, who, funny enough, Canada has always been tinkering on the brink of trying to meet up with the 2% defense spend. So they're also coming under the light. And all of this is a big issue because the world seems to be preparing for a Trump presidency. So whether Biden had a great speech or not, I think that if we look into our crystal ball, the world is preparing for Biden to exit in a few months.
Dr. Rubin, what do you think?
The big story today on the international scene is the NATO summit, which opened today in Washington, D.C., hosted by the Americans. Now, you started by referring to President Joe Biden's speech. It was 13 minutes, 13 minutes. And one of the things that we noted was that he wasn't fumbling as he did in the debate. He had some amount of clarity, and one of the things he has proposed is more support for Ukraine. Now, it's not surprising because that summit is serving 2 major purposes, or 3, if I may define them. The first is that the theme of the summit is Ukraine and transatlantic security. The second thing is that there will be discussions about defense spending. The third thing is that it's about the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the establishment of NATO. The NATO alliance, 30 European countries, 2 North American countries, 32 members, now, coming together after the establishment of this NATO that was established in April 4, 1949, to mark the end of the world with the motto, deterrence, to deter people who want to collapse the global order. Jens Stoltenberg, 2 highlights. Jens Stoltenberg, who has been Secretary General, is stepping down. So there's going to be another Secretary General. And Jens Stoltenberg was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Biden today, this morning. And then, of course, you also have Sweden appearing at the NATO summit for the first time, having been the most recently admitted member of NATO. Now, on Ukraine, there will be a lot of talk about defense spending. You mentioned the Prime Minister
Yes.
Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer is going to be at that summit, accompanied by his wife, Victoria, accompanied by Lamy, the Foreign Secretary, and accompanied by the Minister in charge of European Affairs. And he is under pressure with regard to defense spending. And we're told that he's set to push for more funding for Ukraine and to push to make a pledge that England, or rather the United Kingdom, is going to increase its spending between 2.3% to 2.5%. But that 2.3 to 2.5%, we'll get the details next week, but those details will not include timetable as to when it will be done. Right. And finally, the big question is whether Ukraine will be allowed to join NATO. There are countries that are pushing for Ukraine to become a member, something that they know that Russia is supposed to.
Correct.
However, Russia on Monday attacked a children's cancer hospital in Ukraine. And that has given bigger concern, about defense spending and the need for the countries to ramp up the strength of their various militaries. Because the world, it is assumed, is at a more dangerous place now than even it was on April 4, 1949.
Correct. Well, we're talking again about military spending in a lot of our different newspapers. So let's take a look at the front page of these different newspapers all over the world. We'll start here in Nigeria with the front page of This Day. Many stories jump out, but the lead story today is looking at President Tinubu's creation of this livestock ministry, and he has named former INEC chairman Atahiru Jega. He's named Jega as the deputy and the co-chair of this new ministry, of this new alliance. I know you all have discussed about whether or not this is a viable solution to the problem, whether or not it tackles the issues on the ground, primarily being open grazing or cattle ranching. Is this something that is necessary or not, essentially? Or is this another example of perhaps the government making an effort and it not being welcomed by the people? That's the first page. That's the first paper there. Moving on from the Guardian to This Day to the Guardian. The Guardian Nigeria takes a look at many stories, but one, it's just a teeny beeny bit on the front page. It looks at the Ondo Forest Reserve and how a part of that forest reserve has been sold to a private company. The farmers in Ondo are furious with this, upset, and they feel hoodwinked, they feel bamboozled, because according to them, they've been paying their rents on time to the government, and now this sale to a private entity could trigger what they fear, mismanagement. Could this create some instability? Could this create a food crisis in Ondo State? We don't know, but this is the situation at hand with this forest reserve being sold to a private entity, and the farmers therein are not happy about it. From The Guardian, let's take a look at The Vanguard. The Vanguard is looking at Nigeria's oil production situation. It discusses a 400 billion naira production shortfall here in Nigeria, and that is threatening our 2024 budget. So it is a look at Nigeria's deficit issues, funding issues, but definitely this reality that we're seeing every single day with fuel prices being at the level that they are. Moving on from the Vanguard, the Punch also is talking about oil and the fuel crisis, and they're talking about how the NNPC is looking for another $2 billion in a crude-backed loan. Again, this is not something that many Nigerians want to hear, because, again, this just continues to underscore the financial imbalances that we're looking at when we take a close look at the fuel industry. And it shouldn't be so in a country like Nigeria with so much of oil, with its oil reserves. It just seems as though, the resource curse, something that we've been discussing for years and years and years. I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on Nigeria's resource curse. So to see it continuing to show its face all of these years later, it is quite sobering. So that's the front page of The Punch. And then lastly, our last Nigerian paper will be the Daily Independent. And they are looking at how the federal government is seeking to invest in Nigeria-made vehicles. Rufai, I know that you've been discussing the need for Nigeria to focus on Nigeria-made products across the spectrum. I know that you mentioned you have mentioned rather the prospect of a Nigerian-based vehicle. So when you're hearing this news, how does it come across to you?
Makes me happy. They should do more because other countries that their vehicles are top in the world is because the government invested in them. Take, for instance, we're talking about one of the biggest electric car producers in the world now, BYD. BYD, the Chinese government pumps in about $1 billion US every year, $1 billion into that company. So we should also have that. And how can we start this? A lot of investment in local companies. The president should start by changing his fleet to Innoson Nord, all the Nigerian-made cars and everything in this world you can ever think of. That's how we can make it a pride of place. When Nigerian government had a partnership with Peugeot Automobile in the 70s, most of Nigerian government fleets were Peugeots. That was why Peugeot became the #1 car in the government fleet. So we should also go back to that, to be able to promote the cars that are being made locally, to be able to boost the auto industry. That is as long as Nigeria itself, because most of these companies were coupling cars here in the 50s and 60s.
Right.
But we never improved on all of that. And selling forest areas, forest ranges to private individuals, we must have a rethink as regards that. Because we can make a lot of money from our forests. Carbon seeding is one. Carbon trading is another one. There's a lot of money we can make when we protect our forests. But
Definitely. Well, let's move on to another paper. If we look at the front page of the Daily Nation in Kenya, then I know that you've seen this story. I'd love for your comments on it. The front page of the Daily Nation, they talk about the prospect of a Ruto-Raila alliance. Perhaps after all of the fighting, or after all of the mudslinging back and forth, is the prospect of some form of what we're seeing in South Africa with this government of national unity. Do you think that William Ruto and Raila Odinga can come together and lead Kenya this way?
Again, it would be the way to end that question, because remember that Raila has been in government as a handshake prime minister, I believe he was, but that was under Uhuru Kenyatta. I believe there was an overlap at some point. Ruto was in government, but he wasn't deputy president yet at that time. Can there be a Ruto-Raila alliance or government of national unity based off, because right now we're taking our cues from Kenya's Gen Z, because they clearly are holding the conversation. The answer to that, I believe, for now is no. Why is it a no? Because first of all, after that meeting was held, so this meeting was held and all parties were told to pay for their own expenses, to come and have this national dialogue to try and find the best way to steer themselves forward. Now, people are saying that before this national dialogue was held between opposition leader Raila Odinga and the sitting president William Ruto, possibly a visit to the families of those who lost their children during the protests could have been in order, possibly a moment of silence to acknowledge what the nation has been going through. So this has been analyzed as a way for politicians to all protect their own interests. So will this appeal to people? I don't think so, because right now there's a serious case of them and us, and right now young people just feel that these politicians are now joining forces so that they can protect themselves, because they've realized that we are more than them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for your comments on that, Vimbai. We'll be keeping an eye. Dr. Rubin, we'll come to you for comment on these last two papers. Let's take a look at the front page of the Times in the UK. And they are looking at what Dr. Rubin was already discussing. Essentially, a warning. Starmer is playing with fire on defence spending. So again, there are going to be a lot of scrutiny on the whole of Keir Starmer's premiership, but also looking at what he's going to do with domestic defense spending, in addition to the conversations that he's been having in Washington with those at NATO. And then at the top there, Kemi Badenoch, she has taken some form of a swipe towards former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who was able to hold on to his seat. I think it's the Richmond and I can't even remember the others. It's a double-barreled constituency, but he held on to his seat. That being said, Kemi Badenoch does believe that he is responsible in some parts over election decisions that contributed to the loss that the Conservative Party experienced last week at the general election. I do think that this is an example of Kemi Badenoch perhaps starting the very first steps of her journey towards, hopefully, in her camp, becoming the Conservative Party's next leader. So that's the cover of the Times UK. And then, Dr. Rubin, there's also the cover of the UK's Guardian. And they are looking again on Starmer, calling on NATO to raise defence spending. And I'm sure there are many voices in the UK that want Starmer to raise defence spending in the UK as well. And then you've also got a picture of that Jude Bellingham, and that looks like the side of Harry Kane's head. They'll be playing their semi-final against Netherlands today. So
Okay, very quickly, let me run through the stories. The main story about defense spending, I was commenting on that earlier on. What has happened is that former military chiefs in the United Kingdom are saying that the world is in a more dangerous place now, and that England is not, the United Kingdom is not prepared in the face of what happened on Monday with Russia attacking Children's Cancer Hospital in Kiev. But the matter has been on the table before now about defense spending. Now, Keir Starmer says he's promising between 2.3% of GDP to 2.5%. Now, the Defense Secretary is going to unveil the details and establish the commitment of a root and branch review of security defense spending in the United Kingdom. But what Starmer said is not going to put a date to it in order not to tie his hands. But it's a big issue in the United Kingdom. How prepared is the United Kingdom, for defense in a world where, there's crisis almost everywhere? The second thing, Kemi Badenoch. Now, Kemi Badenoch, the shadow ministers had their first meeting yesterday, and she used the occasion to criticize Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak himself has apologized that, well, he's sorry, we lost the election. But Kemi Badenoch is saying, one, he should not have called a snap election without consulting ministers. In fact, she said that he consulted some buffoons. I don't want to mention the names of the buffoons.
What difference would it have made? Whether it was July or November, what difference would it have made to the outcome?
But she said she consulted some buffoons. Right. She said it was wrong of him to have left the D-Day commemoration earlier to go and have a TV interview. And if he had stayed back, when Keir Starmer stayed back, maybe persons like Penny Mordaunt would not have lost their seats. She said, three, that, she doesn't think that many members of her party realize the magnitude of the loss by the Tories and the landslide by the Labour Party. But don't forget that, basically, she sounded like she was speaking for the MPs on the Tories part that lost their seats. But she also has a selfish ambition.
Well, there we go.
She wants to become leader of the Conservative Party. So she's in the running. So maybe.
Do you think it's possible? Before we go, that's my last question.
Well, we can't rule out anything. It's possible.
Do you think it's possible? Why do you think it's possible?
She's as qualified as anyone else.
With the revolving door in the country.
In the United Kingdom, a black woman, the head, it's possible?
Over possible.
If Kemi Badenoch becomes the leader of the Conservative Party, Dr. Rubin, I will eat your bow tie on this table.
Yeah,
Even your bow tie, can you shake on? That's all I have today.
Oh yeah,
You've got my word.
Okay, I'll leave my case. But Kemi is now Shadow Housing Secretary. That's what she is now. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.